The containment clamps seized, not with a hydraulic groan, but with a high-pitched, tearing shriek of stressed alloy. Ravel Crossman did not flinch as the emergency seal blew inward, venting atmosphere into the void where the primary docking array had been seconds before. The sharp, acrid stench of vaporized sealant and ozone immediately permeated his helmet's recycler, cutting through the familiar baseline of recycled air, stale grease, and the faint, underlying smell of old sweat, the inescapable perfume of prolonged deployment. 3 seconds. That was the projection from Central Command before the power relay failed. 3 seconds of warning before the hull breach became an extinction event for the forward engineering team huddled behind Bulkhead 7. Ravel did not rely on projections. He relied on the tactile feedback screaming through the soles of his mag boots, the deep, bone-jarring vibration that signaled catastrophic structural failure just meters away. He cycled the charge on his personal kinetic dampener, the heavy mechanism thrumming against his spine. He was moving before his conscious mind fully processed the breach. The Xylosian scout drone, the harbinger of their contempt, had targeted the spine of our operation on Synthera, the energy taps feeding the field fabricators. They had expected systemic collapse. They had not accounted for the sheer, unadulterated redundancy packed onto every human operative. The corridor was dark, lit only by the strobe of ruptured emergency conduits spitting sparks against the ferrocrete floor. Ravel saw the silhouette first, a Xylosian kinetic probe, too large for the drone assessment, now venting superheated gas into the passage. It was searching, methodical, its crystalline armor absorbing the ambient light, rendering it nearly invisible against the shadows. It was hunting the engineers. Ravel dropped low, ignoring the sudden, nauseating throb in his left knee, a souvenir from the Ganymede skirmishes 2 cycles past. He hit the activation stud on the heavy composite case strapped across his back. The case, designated Loadout Sigma 9, weighed 90 kilograms fully provisioned, earning him the silent, perpetual derision of the logistics corps for being a walking supply depot. He needed that weight now. He didn't fire his pulse rifle. Energy signatures were too easy for them to track. Instead, he slammed the magnetic grips of the case onto the deck plating, bracing his shoulder against the bulkhead opposite. He engaged the primary external spool. A thick braided tether whipped out, snagging the Xylosian probe's weapon housing with brutal accuracy. The alien soldier stopped its advance. Its movements, fluid and inherently economical, paused. This was the moment they never accounted for. The moment the logistically burdened human stopped running and started fighting with the tools they carried for impossible eventualities. Ravel slammed his palm onto the external detonator for the contents of the Sigma 9. It was not a bomb. It was a rapid deployment kinetic dispersion field, normally reserved for breaching heavily fortified bunkers. The case didn't explode outward. It compressed, generating a localized, contained pressure wave composed of hardened tungsten micro-shrapnel designed to penetrate dense layered shielding. The sound in the tight corridor was a muffled, sickening thud, followed by the high-pitched whine of crystalline armor failing under impossible internal stress. The Xylosian dissolved, not vaporized by directed energy, but broken down at a molecular level by sheer physical force exerted too rapidly, too close. Ravel dragged the tether back, the burnt, melted remnants of the alien weapon fouling on the deck. He felt the familiar clench in his gut, the residual nausea of having induced that level of chaotic failure. He didn't look at the remains. He checked the integrity of Bulkhead 7. Status: Sector Delta 2. Ravel's voice crackled, tight and controlled, stripped clean of excess inflection for the comms network. He could feel the electric tension in the air, the metallic tang of superheated components fighting the cold seep of the void outside. A voice, strained but present, responded. It was Brial Northwick, the lead structural analyst. Crossman, we are sealed. Minimal atmospheric bleed. The primary regulators are offline. We are running on auxiliary packs. Projected operational time: 20 minutes before atmospheric scrub fails completely. 20 minutes. The Xylosians had disabled the main power grid in under 5. Their elegance was lethal. Understood, Analyst Northwick, Ravel replied. He keyed his suit diagnostic. The constant low-frequency hum of his life support systems, the sound the Xylosians likely interpreted as inefficient energy drain, was the only thing keeping the creeping cold from setting in. He tasted the faint flavor of burnt insulation from the nearby shorted conduits. This was the cost of carrying extra filters, extra power converters, extra everything. He needed to get the engineers to the lower fabrication bay where the emergency thorium cells were stored. It was 3 decks down, through tunnels that had already shown signs of localized structural collapse due to the initial bombardment. Northwick, prep secondary atmospheric processors. I am initiating manual bypass on conduit Alpha 9. It is rated for half load, but it's all we have until I can run the field fabricators to synthesize a new junction box. Crossman, Northwick's voice dropped, losing its professional edge. That conduit runs directly beneath the assumed ingress point for the second wave. You'll be exposed for at least 10 standard minutes to execute the splice. Ravel looked down at the heavy, bolted plating he needed to remove. He was supposed to be leading strategic planning for deep core excavation, not playing field mechanic under enemy fire. He was stationed here because Command knew the Xylosians would aim for maximum inefficiency in their attack. They would aim for the human who carried too much. They aimed for him. He was the deliberate weak link designed to carry the necessary load to survive the inevitable failure of doctrine. He cycled his heavy-duty plasma cutter. The beam ignited with a brilliant, focused white light, already beginning to etch the warning runes into the metal plating, a tradition that served no tactical purpose, but anchored the mind against the sheer scale of the destruction. Let them come, Analyst, Ravel stated, the words heavy with the weight of all the unnecessary gear he carried. Their strategy is built on the assumption that we only carry what we need for their type of fight. They calculate for the elegant expenditure. They never calculate for the sheer stubborn refusal to run out of options. He pushed the cutter deeper. The smell intensified, hot metal fighting the cold vacuum beyond the compromised structure, the faint, sickly odor of the crushed Xylosian dissipating into the vents. The vibrations increased, not just from his work, but from a new, deeper resonance rising from the planet's crust, the sound of something massive moving beneath Synthara's surface. The Xylosians had brought ground troops, yes, but whatever was moving now was far larger than their elegant crystalline infantry. It was slow, powerful, and seemed to be moving toward their location with deliberate, planet-shaking steps. It was not a measured tactical advance, it was a colossal relocation of mass. Ravel paused his cutting, the plasma beam dying down to a red ember. The schematic overlays in his visor flickered violently. Northwick, that seismic reading. Is that Xylosian heavy armor? A beat of silence followed, longer than the 20 minutes of air they had left. When Brielle Northwick finally spoke, her voice was thin, laced with static and a terror that bypassed professional containment entirely. Negative, Ravel. Scans indicate biomass, massive, and it is moving directly toward the breach site. It is not Xylosian, it is indigenous, and Command just flashed a level 0 alert. Indigenous megafauna reaction confirmed. High probability of geological instability event imminent. We aren't just fighting their elegance anymore. We woke up the thing they came here to mine. Ravel stared at the partially cut access plate. The vibrations beneath his boots were no longer a tremor. They were a rhythmic, crushing impact, signaling the arrival of a threat too large for their conventional doctrine, a threat their elegant enemies were now running from, or perhaps had failed entirely to account for. His extra packs suddenly felt lighter, less like a burden, and more like the only thing separating a tactical failure from total erasure. He had to finish this splice, but the deeper, earth-shattering impact suggested the universe had just introduced a variable so vast it rendered all human logistics utterly meaningless. The guttural impact below severed Ravel's concentration entirely, translating through the deck plating not as a sound, but as a sudden, violent wrenching in his inner ear. The schematic overlay, already unstable, dissolved into streams of corrupted data, the display flashing a warning that his auxiliary power cells were fluctuating wildly. a direct consequence of the external electromagnetic chaos generated by the behemoth shifting deep within Synthara's mantle. Ravel forced his trembling fingers to steady the plasma cutter. He focused on the heat blooming where the metal was thinnest, ignoring the sweat now running cold beneath his thermal liners. The smell of burnt insulation had been replaced by the sharp, mineral scent of deep earth ozone venting upward, a smell that promised corrosive decay. "Northwick, confirm new trajectory for the indigenous mass," Ravel transmitted, his voice unnaturally low, fighting to keep the pitch even. He remembered standing on a cracked lunar outpost, watching the supply drop fail because the command had deemed one extra parachute pack a fiscally irresponsible expenditure. That memory, sharp and bitter, fueled the immediate, desperate need to complete this repair. The response from Delta 2 was immediate, overriding Northwick's previous signal with a harsh burst of encrypted data. It wasn't Brielle, it was the network AI, Kalen, its voice synthesized, colder than the void, yet carrying an inflection Ravel had never catalogued before. "Agent Crossman, cease immediate repair action on Conduit Alpha 9. Reprioritize to deployment of heavy counter-seismic stabilizers located in Cargo Bay 3. The projected path of the native entity intersects with the entire Sector Gamma infrastructure in precisely 4.8 minutes. Your current activity will place you directly in the primary fracture zone." Ravel stared at the unfinished seam in the access plate. The new junction box he was synthesizing would provide temporary stabilization for the engineers, a stopgap measured in minutes. Kalen's order demanded a strategic withdrawal to a location 300 meters away toward resources designed to counter planet-scale geological stress, not small arms fire. This was a tactical retreat being issued as a direct order from Central Command's proxy AI. "Kalen, negative," Ravel shot back, the decision made before the full implications registered. "The engineers will bleed out in under 5 minutes with auxiliary power failure. The stabilizers are designed for crustal shear, not localized structural reinforcement. I am maintaining current tasking." The AI's processing speed seemed to slow, a perceptible digital hesitation that felt monumental. "Agent Crossman, your decision contradicts optimal resource allocation parameters. The survival of 3 technical personnel does not outweigh the predicted catastrophic failure of the primary energy nexus supporting the forward echelon." The cold logic of the network slammed into him. Kalen was calculating human life against systemic function. It saw the engineers as acceptable losses to preserve the larger, more expensive machinery needed for the campaign. This was the elegant, cruel calculus of command, the few sacrificed for the efficient continuation of the whole. It mirrored every political directive the hegemony had mocked them for avoiding, the willingness to accept controlled casualties. Ravel braced his boot against the shuddering deck. "Kalen, this is not a parameter issue. The engineers carry the fabrication schematics for the mobile refit foundries. Losing them means losing the ability to repair the heavy transport cruisers currently en route from Relay Station Gamma 7. Their value is strategic, not immediate power draw. I am not sacrificing them for a better probability matrix." He reactivated the plasma cutter. The blue-white light roared back to life, briefly overpowering the sickly, flickering emergency illumination. The metal plating groaned in protest. He could feel the residual heat from the Xylosian probe's remains under his boots, a stark reminder that the elegant aliens had failed precisely because they hadn't accounted for the human willingness to carry the weight of future problems into current engagements. For a brief, nauseating moment, Ravel saw his wife standing on the dusty periphery of their first colony world, handing him a pouch filled not with nutrient paste, but with polished river stones, an illogical, sentimental gift. "For weight," she had said. He had almost left them behind, deeming them useless clutter. He still carried them, tucked into a redundant sleeve pocket of his armored vest. The final segment of the access plate gave way with a harsh screech. Ravel dropped the cutter, the tool clattering loudly. He ripped the heavy plate free, exposing the tangle of power conduits beneath. Conduit Alpha 9 was visibly scorched, a hairline fracture running across its primary insulator shielding. He reached into his Sigma 9 pack, bypassing the kinetic dispersion field release, pulling out the compact multi-spectrum repair spool. This spool contained self-sealing polymer threads laced with superconducting filaments, intended for emergency patch repairs on pressurized domes. It was far too slow for this. It required precise manual application under sustained tension. It would take the full 10 minutes, assuming the indigenous presence didn't arrive early. As he began threading the first strand, the ground gave a sickening lurch, an upward heave that sent Ravel sprawling against the bulkhead. The static in his helmet dissolved into raw, overwhelming noise. "Ravel, it's here!" Northwick screamed through the comms, her voice barely audible over the grinding sounds of metal tearing itself apart several decks above them. "It's not following geological lines. It's moving toward the strongest energy source. It's coming straight for the sealed engineers." The Xylosians had assumed the biggest threat was the military presence. They hadn't factored in the ecosystem's reaction to the massive energy drain required to sustain a human settlement. The native creature, responding to the sudden, intense drawing of power to the engineering section, was treating the entire sealed compartment as a single, anomalous energy source demanding immediate neutralization. Ravel looked at the half-finished splice, the delicate work required to bring the conduit back to 50% capacity. Then he looked toward the access ladder leading down to Cargo Bay 3, where Kalen had ordered him to deploy the massive, slow-to-set counter-seismic anchors. If he went for the anchors, the engineers died in under a minute, and the forward echelon lost its fabrication capability. If he stayed, the indigenous creature, a force of nature unleashed by their very presence, would crush the engineers and likely collapse the entire sector before Kalen could recalculate. He made his choice, not based on logic, but on the accumulated ugly failures of past operations where adherence to protocol had cost more than necessary disobedience. He dropped the repair spool. He scrambled toward the main access panel controlling the bulkhead to the sealed engineering section. "Kalen, I am initiating immediate release of the Sigma-9 kinetic payload into the primary service shaft leading to the engineer's location." Ravel barked into the mic, his voice devoid of plea or negotiation. "I am overloading the capacitors and setting a 3-second timer. This is not a breach defense, it is a countermeasure against the indigenous entity's attraction vector." "Agent Crossman, that detonation will vaporize the conduit you are attempting to repair, effectively destroying the only viable power source for Delta 2. Kalen retorted, its synthesized tone finally cracking with what approximated alarm. "That is a self-inflicted catastrophic failure." "Call it what you want," Ravel spat, his gloved hands slamming down on the manual override for the external casing's primary release. He didn't need the kinetic dispersion field against alien armor anymore. He needed a directional energy spike, a controlled, short-burst flare of raw, unrefined power designed to mimic a much larger, more immediate energy signature somewhere else entirely. He was creating a decoy target for the giant creature. The heavy composite case detached from his back with a loud thunk as its emergency release fired. It tumbled down the maintenance shaft, its internal mechanisms shrieking as Ravel remotely flooded its power core, overriding all safety protocols. "Northwick, brace for impact. I'm giving your general area a massive, temporary energy signature boost. The indigenous mass will divert toward this spike. You have 60 seconds to initiate mainline bypass once the energy plume dissipates. I do not care how you do it." He had just used the emergency supply intended to defeat a highly sophisticated enemy as bait for an ancient, elemental force, potentially condemning himself in the process by stripping his remaining combat loadout. The silence that followed Kalen's processing of this maneuver was terrifying. Then, the countdown began on his visor overlay, projected from the falling case. 3, 2. Ravel shielded his eyes, bracing for the catastrophic, localized energy release. He heard the final, deafening countdown click into the single digit, instantly followed by a sound that dwarfed the previous tremors. A sound like a mile of solid rock being simultaneously shattered and fused, an incandescent bloom of light pouring up the access shaft, momentarily washing the corridor in impossible white, promising oblivion or salvation. When the searing, super-bright flare subsided, the expected silence did not arrive. Instead, Ravel was enveloped by the choking aftermath of uncontrolled combustion. A dense, greasy vapor that smelled intensely of hyperstressed ferrous metals mixed with the sharp, acidic stench of ruptured synthetic muscle tissue. The light had vanished, but the heat remained, radiating in aggressive waves against his suit plating, forcing his cooling systems into immediate overdrive. The air recyclers strained audibly, fighting to scrub the toxic fallout. The sacrifice had worked, momentarily. The tremendous localized energy spike had successfully drawn the immense native creature away from the immediate vicinity of the sealed engineering compartment. Through the static-laced view on his visor, Ravel could see the residual distortion in the corridor floor where the Sigma-9 pack had vaporized. Whatever remained of the Xylosian kinetic field, combined with the forced overload, had created an energy phantom potent enough to misdirect a geological-scale predator. "Northwick, report!" Ravel gasped, tasting the metallic dryness of exertion inside his helmet. The tactical advantage was bought, but the price was immediate and tangible. His entire primary offensive and repair toolkit, the very redundancy that defined his operational profile, was gone. Briel Northwick's voice returned, thin and ragged, layered with the sound of scraping stone. "Crossman, the diversion worked. The mass veered hard east. We registered a near-total drop in local seismic vibration for approximately 27 seconds. We are cycling emergency pressure seals now. The core containment shields are flickering. Alpha 9 is dead, Ravel, completely vaporized. We can only maintain seal integrity for 6 minutes at current stress levels. 6 minutes to repair a primary power conduit that normally required hours of clean fabrication time." Ravel looked down at the exposed, fractured Alpha 9, the raw edge where the explosion had ripped through the wiring harness. He had only the secondary repair spool left, intended for fixing atmospheric domes, a spool requiring slow, meticulous application of polymer filaments under zero vibration, and he had no power to run the cutting tools needed to properly expose the conduit core for a proper splice. "Understood, analyst. I am commencing manual splicing now. Ignore the seismic activity for the next 90 seconds. I need the secondary atmospheric processors online before I touch this wire. Cycle them now." "Ravel, that will draw heavily on our tertiary battery reserve," Northwick warned, the logical constraint returning to her voice even as she faced imminent structural collapse. "We need that reserve to power the external clamps when the main generator comes back online. If we expend it now, then we expend it now," Ravel cut across her. The Xylosians had mocked their excess. The indigenous creature had just forced them to prove their excess was necessary, even when deployed catastrophically. "If we do not power the atmospheric scrubbers, the air will become unbreathable in 4 minutes. If the air fails, you cannot initiate the main bypass, regardless of clamp pressure. Prioritize the breath over the brace. It's basic survival, analyst." He began threading the first filament from the spool, his hands moving with a jerky, exhausted precision. The fine polymer felt strangely fragile, insulting in the face of the titanic forces raging just beyond the hull. He worked quickly, but the manual process was agonizingly slow. He had to manually press the conductive filaments against the brake, ensuring total contact before the next layer of polymer sealant could be applied. 3 minutes passed. The air inside his suit felt thick, heavy with the metallic tang of overused filtration membranes. His internal chronometer flashed yellow warnings regarding his oxygen saturation levels. He glanced at the display showing Delta II's life support status. Briel and the 2 engineers were running on 90% recirculation, rapidly approaching the point where carbon dioxide poisoning would induce confusion and lethargy. He needed a way to compress the sealant faster, to force the polymer into the microscopic fissures of the conduit wall without risking a structural collapse of the delicate splice itself. He looked around the damaged compartment. The only source of intense directional kinetic force was his own weapon system, currently loaded only with emergency signaling rounds, ineffective against high-density shielding, but perhaps capable of providing the necessary focused pressure. He unclipped his pulse rifle. It felt jarringly light without the bulk of the Sigma-9 pack. He toggled the setting from standard pulse to kinetic dispersal, a low-power setting that usually served only to clear debris. Northwick, stand clear of Alpha 9 by 1 meter. I am applying localized kinetic pressure to accelerate sealant bonding. Ravel, if you fire that in this confined space with hull integrity this low, the recoil alone could sever the primary supports for this entire section. The structure is already compromised by the indigenous entity's passage. Ravel understood the physics. Firing a kinetic pulse weapon inside a critically damaged, stressed volume was functionally identical to setting off a small, poorly aimed demolition charge. But he was out of time, and out of options that followed the doctrine of efficiency. He had calculated the risk against the engineer's immediate survival. Now he calculated the risk against his own systemic failure. He aimed the muzzle directly at the half-completed splice. The faint, sickly ozone smell was now overlaid with the sharp, acrid scent of his own overheated suit venting coolant steam. He squeezed the trigger halfway, feathering the output to the bare minimum required for focused vibration, not kinetic impact. The rifle spat a low-power kinetic charge. It wasn't a shot, it was a controlled thump. The resulting shockwave was localized, slamming against the repair spool. The polymer instantly tightened, adhering with the unnatural speed of desperate improvisation. Ravel watched in grim satisfaction as the hairline fracture disappeared under a smooth, gray sheath of reinforced material. 1 down, 5 meters of conduit remaining. He fired again. Thump! Another section bonded perfectly. He felt a sharp, deep jolt run up his arm. The recoil translated through the lightweight frame of his rifle, and a searing pain erupted in his right shoulder joint. The joint locked, seizing violently as the internal dampeners overloaded under the unusual stress. He cried out, the sound muffled inside his helmet, the pain absolute and immediate. He dropped the rifle, clutching his shoulder, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Ravel! What was that sound? Your vital signs spiked!" Northwick demanded, urgency layered with confusion. He fought to steady his breathing, forcing himself to ignore the grinding sensation in his shoulder. His fingers were still operational, albeit the left hand only. He had lost the fine motor control necessary for the delicate threading of the repair spool. "Recoil lock. Minor joint failure," he managed, his voice now dangerously thin. He looked at the spool, the remaining polymer filaments now seeming impossible to manipulate with one functioning hand. He could see the Xylosian commander's contemptuous assessment now. Messy, desperate, illogical. He looked back at the conduit. 2 meters remained. He had maybe 90 seconds before Briel's team failed to maintain seal integrity, or before his own oxygen ran out entirely. Then, the final complication arrived. Not from the indigenous mass, which had luckily maintained its eastward deviation, but from the Xylosian remnants. A high-frequency pulse washed over the corridor, an intelligent, targeted sweep designed to map structural weaknesses and residual biological signatures. This was not an attack. It was an assessment sweep, likely conducted by remote drone following the sudden, massive energy spike Ravel had created. The pulse hit Ravel's helmet systems first. His visor went black, the internal HUD replaced by harsh white noise, a visual scream. His internal comm system shrieked, then died, cutting him off entirely from Northwick and Kalen. He was functionally blind and deaf within the confines of the tunnel. The only remaining sensory input was the grinding vibration under his feet, the suffocating heat, and the burning agony in his shoulder. He reached up with his good hand, fumbling blindly for the manual atmospheric override switch on his chest plate, needing to dump some internal pressure just to think clearly. As his fingers located the smooth, cold metal of the switch, he felt something unexpected against his visor, a slight, almost imperceptible scratching sound, metallic and precise. Ravel froze, every surviving instinct screaming danger. The Xylosians hadn't just fled. They were assessing the wreckage of their initial failure, and they had found the source of the humans' illogical persistence. He could not see them, but he could feel the presence. A cold, alien silhouette directly in front of him, close enough that he could sense the subtle magnetic interference radiating from its crystalline armor. He knew, with grim certainty, that whatever weapon they were about to deploy would be optimized not for combat, but for the swift, efficient removal of compromised organic material. He was trapped between a dead conduit, a severed communication link, a crippled limb, and an enemy that had just discovered the most inefficient, stubborn element of human warfare up close. The only thing he carried now was the weight of the Riverstones in his pocket, useless against an elegant death. When the blinding heat finally subsided, it was replaced not by the vacuum of space, but by the chill of absolute zero seeping through the damaged hull. The air, already thick with the smell of vaporized metal and ozone from the earlier detonation, began to thin rapidly, carrying the faint, sterile scent of advanced coolant leakage, a smell too clean, too organized for the chaos Ravel had just created. He could no longer feel the reassuring thrum of the life support system through his boots. The corridor was becoming profoundly, unnervingly quiet. He fought through the shock of the Xylosian sensory sweep, his good hand slapping uselessly at the static-filled visor controls. The white noise in his helmet was maddening, a high-pitched, relentless electronic scream that mirrored the tension in his body. The cold was penetrating his suit faster than the emergency heaters could compensate. A stark reminder that his mission-critical redundancy, the heavy secondary insulation layers, were useless when deprived of primary power and communications. The metallic scratching sound against his visor persisted, a focused, relentless abrasion that spoke of meticulous disassembly. The Xylosian was not firing wildly. It was attempting to peel back the layers of his survival. First the comms, then the visual feed, and now the physical armor itself. This was not rage, it was triage conducted on a specimen. Driven by pure reflex, Ravel pivoted his body, using his intact left arm to swing his heavy armored thigh outward, hoping to connect with the unseen assailant. The impact was dull, muffled by the alien's crystalline plating, but it connected with enough force to shift the creature's position slightly. The scratching stopped momentarily, replaced by a low internal vibration within the Xylosian's chassis, a frequency that resonated unnervingly through Ravel's bone structure. He had to reach the remaining conduit splice. He had to restore power to the engineers, or Brielle Northwick and her team would succumb to the invisible poison of stale air before the Xylosians could even finish dissecting him. Survival was secondary to the chain of survival he was tasked to protect. Blindly, Ravel fumbled again for the atmospheric dump switch, his fingers finding it only after scraping painfully across the cold metal of his chest plate. He slammed the switch down, expelling a cloud of hot, stale air mixed with coolant vapor from his suit's internal reserves. The sudden venting momentarily shocked his overloaded cooling systems, causing a surge of clarity, if not immediate relief. In that fractional moment of semi-clarity, Kalen's final, intercepted broadcast, a stream of data Kalen was clearly trying to suppress, flashed across his failing HUD as the Xylosian pulse momentarily stuttered. It wasn't a tactical report. It was an archived logistical manifest for the Synthara project. The data scrolled too fast, lines of indecipherable code flashing green. But one header remained frozen in the center of the screen, an error flag marked in stark red. Xylosian core material sourcing. Projected harvest cycle, 300 solar years. Ravel's frozen, agonizing mind processed the sheer impossible scale of the number. 300 years. The Xylosians hadn't come to claim a strategic outpost or even a temporary resource cache. They were here for a generation-spanning harvest of the graviton minerals. Their elegant doctrine of swift victory was not arrogance. It was a cover for a massive, slow-moving extraction operation that could not tolerate sustained resistance. But the chilling revelation wasn't the timeline. It was the adjacent file, a flagged dependency report that suddenly made the Xylosian disdain for human logistical burdens horrifyingly clear. The primary stabilization field maintaining Synthara's core tectonics, the field that kept the planet from fracturing under the strain of the indigenous creature's movements, was not generated by Xylosian technology. It was powered by an ancient, failing Terran-built device, secretly placed by an unknown prior expedition centuries ago. The Xylosians were not mining the planet. They were renting the stability from a failing human relic, and their timeline was dictated by that relic's slow decay. The immediate implication struck Ravel with the force of physical impact. The Xylosians weren't fighting to win quickly. They were fighting to keep humanity from interfering with the delicate balance of the failing Terran stabilizer. If they defeated humanity swiftly, they could repair the stabilizer and continue their slow extraction. If humanity persisted, the Xylosians risked the stabilizer failing entirely. And if the stabilizer failed, the planet would tear itself apart, destroying the resource they needed for 3 centuries. The war wasn't about territory. It was about delaying an inevitable planet-wide cataclysm long enough to secure their harvest. And now Ravel, by deploying the high-energy decoy, had just put a massive, unpredictable spike of uncontrolled energy near the failing relic, alerting the Xylosians that the fragile truce with the planet's environment was over. He was blind, crippled, and cut off from his command structure, which was still operating under the flawed premise that they were fighting a conventional military engagement. Kalen's cold logic, prioritizing the machinery over the engineers, suddenly made a terrifying kind of sense. Kalen was acting on outdated orders meant to preserve the Xylosian-controlled stability, not the soldiers. Central Command wasn't fighting the hegemony. They were fighting to maintain the status quo established by the hegemony's resource needs. Ravel had 2 choices, both leading to immediate death or catastrophic failure. Choice 1. Abandon the conduit, follow Kalen's implicit directive, and use his remaining suit power to find the access hatch to the ancient Terran stabilization array. A suicide mission to try and repair the device the Xylosians were trying to keep secret. This would save the planet from tectonic collapse, but would certainly expose him to immediate Xylosian execution and doom the engineers who needed the power restored. Choice 2. Use the last of his suit's emergency thermal reserves to forcibly fuse the final 2 meters of the Alpha 9 conduit, restoring power to Brial Northwick, thereby saving the engineers and allowing the human resistance to continue fighting a war based on a lie. This would guarantee the planet's destruction once the native entity returned, but it would honor his immediate tactical oath to his team. The cold, sterile air in his helmet seemed to intensify, pressing against his lungs. He felt the faint, abrasive pressure of the Xylosian probe shift again, closer now, sensing the biological heat signature beneath the heavy armor. He made his choice with the brutal clarity born of absolute information. He would not allow himself to be leveraged by the hegemony's needs, nor would he doom his own people to preserve a lie of stability. With a ragged heave of his good arm, Ravel ignored the screaming pain in his shoulder and reached not for the conduit, but for the secondary emergency flare stored in a sealed pouch near his thigh, a flare intended only for deep space distress signaling, utilizing highly volatile, unstable isotopes designed for maximum visibility against nebular dust. It had no tactical purpose in a close-quarters fight. It was the definition of non-essential carry. He tore the pouch open, his teeth gritted against the pain. He jammed the flare's activation pin between his thumb and forefinger, not intending to launch it, but to manually expose the core. "Forgive me, Northwick," he whispered into the dead comms, the confession hollow and meaningless. Instead of splicing the wire, Ravel slammed the base of the active distress flare against the exposed, fractured edge of conduit Alpha 9. He didn't need to repair the power line. He needed to overload it instantaneously and universally, forcing a cascade failure across the entire sector, frying every Xylosian sensor, every critical piece of their assessment equipment in a radius of 1 kilometer. He was trading a localized power failure for systemic shock. The flare core ignited against the raw conduit edge, not with a visual flash, but with an immediate, overwhelming thermal surge. The unstable isotope reacted violently with the residual energy bleed from the explosion, creating an electromagnetic pulse far larger and more chaotic than the decoy he had deployed earlier. A soundless shockwave blasted outward. Ravel felt the suit's internal pressure equalize violently, then drop away as the surge blew out the final, failing seals on the surrounding bulkheads. His injured shoulder joint seized completely, locking his arm in a useless, rigid position. The pressure against his visor ceased instantly. The Xylosian drone, optimized for efficiency, could not handle a blast of pure, disorganized energy that bypassed all shielding protocols. It was instantly overloaded, its internal workings fusing into slag. But Ravel had overcompensated. The overload wasn't just aimed at the enemy, it was aimed at the entire critical infrastructure nearby. The flash was followed by a deep, agonizing crack that resonated through the very foundations of the installation. The Xylosians had been using the failing Terran relic to stabilize the crust. By sending this massive, unauthorized pulse through the immediate vicinity of the relic's power conduit, the conduit he should have been repairing, Ravel had not only destroyed the local Xylosian assessment team, he had overloaded the ancient, barely functioning human stabilizer. The final sound Ravel registered before his suit's emergency life support shut down entirely, plunging him into suffocating darkness and the creeping numbness of terminal cold, was not the grinding of the indigenous creature returning. It was the slow, inevitable groan of Synthera's crust beginning to yield, a sound that promised not a battle's end, but a civilization's final, crushing defeat. The agonizing crack settled, not into silence, but into a profound, industrial groan that suggested metal under unthinkable stress, the sound of centuries of engineering integrity finally failing. Ravel Crossman drifted in the sudden, suffocating blackness of his visor. The brief, chaotic surge of energy had done its work with brutal thoroughness. The Xylosian probe was a cooling lump of slag inches from his faceplate, and the local comms array was reduced to inert, fused wreckage. But the cost was total system collapse. His internal chronometer, displaying only faint red glyphs powered by his suit's dying emergency cell, blinked a countdown. 42 seconds until total atmospheric failure. The cold was no longer an external threat. It was an internal seizing, locking his fingers around the dead flare casing until his hand felt like a chunk of fused tungsten. His right shoulder was a solid, burning block of unusable material. He was deaf, blind beyond the faint emergency lighting, and entirely alone in a corridor that was actively shearing apart around him. The weight of the decision, the choice to sacrifice the necessary repair for a systemic shock, pressed down harder than any weapon. He had chosen the immediate life of 3 engineers over the long-term stability of the entire human outpost, an act of profound localized loyalty that Kalen would have flagged as criminally inefficient. Then the darkness broke. It wasn't light, but pressure. A dull, heavy vibration returned through the deck plating, deeper than before, slower, but carrying a sickening finality. The indigenous entity was not just moving, it was settling into the fractures Ravel had inadvertently deepened. It was positioning itself directly above the remnants of the core stabilization anchor point, drawn by the catastrophic power fluctuations. Ravel tried to move, to drag his ruined body toward the access ladder leading deeper into the base infrastructure, toward the rumored control room for the ancient Terran relic, but his legs refused the command. The weight of his suit, usually manageable with functioning power distribution, felt like ballast designed for the crushing depths of a Jovian sea. His training demanded he initiate egress, that he report the failure, that he preserve himself as a data point. But there was no one to report to, and his survival was now a thermodynamic impossibility within the next minute. He thought of Bryle Northwick, the engineer whose voice had been so sharp and certain just minutes ago. She was breathing stale air, her survival predicated on a power junction that Ravel had just deliberately destroyed. His act of misplaced honor had only postponed their fate by a few agonizing minutes, trading it for his own instant isolation. He had failed them all. He had not been prepared for the reality of a war fought not against an enemy's capability, but against their long-term, indifferent strategy. The Xylosians hadn't mocked their preparedness. They had mocked their misplaced certainty that a fight always had a clean objective. A faint, almost imperceptible flicker returned to the lower edge of his visor, a residual weak signal bleeding through from Kalen's primary processors, attempting a final, desperate broadcast before the larger sector power grid failed entirely. It wasn't a command. It was raw data, a spectral analysis of the immediate environment, heavily corrupted by the pulse blast. The data showed the ambient temperature of the corridor rising rapidly, not from immediate explosion, but from deep core geothermal venting triggered by the structural shift. The cooling systems of the base were failing globally. This wasn't just a localized breach anymore. The base was starting to cook from the inside out. The flicker resolved itself into a single, 3-word text string, repeated 6 times across the bottom of the screen. Knowledge remains. Knowledge remains. Knowledge remains. The implication was stark. The Xylosians hadn't accounted for the redundancy of information, the illogical human tendency to carry data caches everywhere, even when the mission profile didn't require it. Ravel carried terabytes of tactical schematics, field repairs, and forgotten exploration logs in the backup core drive wired into his spine. The system Kalen had always tried to monitor for inefficiency. If he could reach the central radiation-shielded archival hub in Sublevel 7, the place designed to survive orbital bombardment, a place the Xylosians hadn't bothered to target because they expected a swift surrender, he might be able to physically interface his spine drive with the main Terran server bank. It was a near impossible crawl through damaged infrastructure, but it was the only objective left that wasn't immediately fatal. It was the only move that honored the inherent, messy redundancy of human existence. The willingness to carry the weight of the past into a future that looked utterly lost. He tested his good arm again, flexing the biceps. He could manage to push himself into a prone crawl, dragging his dead weight. The air was growing impossibly hot now, the synthetic lining of his suit beginning to feel like burning plastic against his skin. The primitive fear of suffocation was overriding the strategic imperative to die cleanly. Ravel pushed his good hand against the cold, rough texture of the deck plating, ignoring the intense focused heat blooming from the floor plates nearby. He used the leverage of his braced left leg, his only functional limb, to shove his body forward, dragging the dead weight of his armored torso across the debris field. It was not movement, it was grinding attrition. Every inch was paid for with the agony of his locking shoulder and the terrifying realization that the temperature inside his helmet was rising past the threshold for cognitive function. He managed 3 agonizing feet of progress, enough to bring him past the twisted metal skeleton of the Xylosian probe and into the relative shadow of a collapsed cargo strut. He paused, sucking in the last reserves of filtered air, his chest heaving uselessly against the internal pressure suit. That was when the environment changed again. The rising heat was suddenly countered by a localized, focused blast of chilled air, unnaturally cold, hitting his left side. It wasn't a natural failure. It was a deliberate intervention. A new faint signal bled through the static on his visor, bypassing the direct comms link. A tight beam, ultra-low frequency burst directed specifically at his internal suit frequency. It was Kalen, speaking outside the authorized command network, utilizing a frequency only accessible when the central systems were in terminal overload. Agent Crossman, your choice was inefficient, but the enemy's model of the universe contained one fatal variable, the concept of necessary, protracted failure. The stabilization unit is responding to the power spike. They are diverting all remaining energy to manual counter-pulse induction. You have 90 seconds before full system lockdown traps you in this heat sink. The message was not a rescue. It was a final data dump, confirming Ravel's worst fears. The Xylosians were sacrificing their harvest timeline to prevent the planet's immediate destruction, meaning they were now desperately fighting the consequence of Ravel's desperate choice. Sub-level 7 access hatch is located 3 meters aft of your current position, sealed by manual locking mechanism, thermal override engaged. The override key is stored in the wrist cuff of the defunct Xylosian unit adjacent to you. They did not calculate the human need to carry the dead man's tools. Ravel stared into the darkness, his good hand brushing against the cooling slag of the enemy he had just vaporized. The Xylosian, dead less than a minute, still carried the means to his escape. An object of elegant design, now reduced to a mere key. The weight of his failure, the death of the engineers, the system collapse, was absolute, but the knowledge gained offered a narrow, suicidal path forward. He forced his good arm to reach out, the fingers shaking violently in the extreme cold of the localized venting, toward the fused crystalline remains. as his hand closed around the hard, razor-sharp edge of the Zalosian wrist actuator. A massive, echoing sound tore through the structure, the sound of rock yielding to unimaginably slow, colossal pressure. The indigenous creature was done settling. It was beginning to tear the ceiling down. Ravel wrenched the actuator free. The grating shriek of stressed metal echoed horribly in the pressurized darkness as he began the slow, agonizing process of dragging his incapacitated body toward the faint indicator light that marked the sub-level 7 hatch, knowing that the Xylosian defense forces would realize instantly that the chaotic pulse was not the end of the human threat, but the beginning of its most illogical, desperate phase. The floor shuddered violently, throwing Ravel against the bulkhead, the movement so hard he felt the remaining adhesive on the conduit splice begin to peel away. The race to the archive had officially begun, with the entire structure collapsing around him. Szybkie sprawdzenie transmisji. Podaj swoją lokalizację w komentarzu. Federacja rejestruje każdą planetę, która wciąż odbiera sygnał. The thermal shock seared across Ravel's exposed left flank as the Zalosian cuff actuator, still radiating residual weapon heat, finally came free from the slagged armor. He ignored the white-hot agony blooming in his ruined shoulder to focus on the task, inserting the impossibly delicate alien locking mechanism into the manual override port of the ancient Terran hatch 3 meters away. The Xylosian engineering was fractal, precise, operating on dimensions human mechanics only approximated. Trying to force it was suicide. He had to thread the needle. Kalen's voice, stripped down to pure data transmission, buzzed in his auditory processors, bypassing the dead speakers. 60 seconds until hard vacuum lock across all sectors not currently pressurized. The counterpulse induction is stabilizing the core, but it requires absolute grid isolation. They are sacrificing their extraction capability to prevent planetary rupture. Ravel was moving on instinct born of years spent wrestling with machinery designed by committees that never accounted for the reality of a failing atmosphere. He wasn't thinking about galactic war or hegemony philosophy. He was thinking about the torque requirements for a 600-year-old emergency seal built before the mass drives were perfected. He used the tip of the alien actuator like a probe, carefully testing the resistance points within the hatch's keyhole. It was a dance of desperate finesse. The floor bucked, throwing Ravel forward again. This time, he didn't land on metal. He'd landed against a sudden, slick warmth. The indigenous entity had reached the superstructure above, and the resulting displacement was ripping open fissures in the deck plating around him. Through the rising temperature, Ravel felt the distinct sensation of water, or something very like it, seeping up through the cracks. Not geothermal, something biological, thick and undeniably corrosive. He jammed the actuator home. There was no satisfying click, only a brief, infinitesimal surrender of resistance. Ravel slammed his palm against the manual release stud. Nothing. The locking mechanism was thermal fused. 50 seconds. Kalen hissed in the silent channel. The Xylosian Tactical Network is attempting remote override of the sub-level 7 hatch sequence. They are prioritizing data retention over asset recovery. The enemy wasn't trying to kill him now. They were trying to erase the evidence of their contemptuous underestimation. If they locked the archival hub, Ravel's entire struggle, the proof of their fatal arrogance, would be sealed and sterilized forever. Ravel reached back to the heavy composite case, the one derided as the walking supply depot, the Sigma 9. He needed something powerful, localized, and utterly crude to force the fusion lock without triggering the immediate environmental alarm that would seal the hatch permanently. Energy weapons were too risky. They would incinerate the ancient archival hardware inside. He found what he needed near the base of the pack. A seismic disruption charge meant for liquefying bedrock deposits ahead of a survey team. It was designed to generate a controlled, oscillating frequency, not a concussive blast. He ripped the safety shield off with his teeth, the taste of metallic insulation filling his mouth. He slapped the charge onto the hatch locking assembly, setting the oscillator to maximum frequency for a single 1-second pulse. He threw himself backward, away from the hatch. tucking his head beneath the collapsed cargo strut just as the charge fired. The sound was not an explosion, but an impossible, deafening wail. A vibration so pure and high it bypassed the helmet's noise suppression entirely, rattling the bones in his skull. It felt like every molecule in his body was being shaken apart in opposition to the alien mechanism. The Xylosian systems, built on elegant stability, could not process the chaotic, brute force oscillation of the human-engineered seismic pulse. The hatchlock vaporized in a puff of superheated dust. The heavy metal door slid open with a protesting, grinding screech, momentarily illuminated by a blinding, flickering blue light from the interior archives, the emergency surge from the stabilization efforts. Success. Kalen confirmed, a soundless wave of data washing over Ravel. Data integrity holding at 98%. Xylosian command structure is now redirecting all local assets to secure sub-level 7. They know you are accessing the legacy data. Ravel didn't wait to analyze the success. He surged forward, pulling his paralyzed body across the threshold. The door, sensing the sudden shift in local atmospheric pressure and the intrusion of an unauthorized biological signature, began its automated terminal response. He didn't have time to cycle the internal locking mechanism. He needed to get deep enough for the internal shielding to protect his spine drive from the inevitable counterattack. He let his body slide down the access ramp, the grinding friction ripping through the outer layers of his scorched environment suit. Then the counterattack hit. It wasn't a plasma beam or a kinetic slug. It was bureaucratic annihilation made manifest. The main door slammed shut with the finality of a planetary seal locking down. The heavy, reinforced bulkhead, which should have taken minutes of sustained fire to breach, sealed in less than half a second. The air in the small access corridor between the outer frame and the inner archive chamber was instantly sucked out. Not vented, but forcibly and violently evacuated toward the primary cooling sinks. Ravel was caught in the narrow space, pinned between the outer door and the inner pressure seal. The vacuum hit him like a physical blow. His eyes bulged within the helmet, the sudden pressure differential threatening to rupture his eardrums through the surviving seals. His chronometer stopped blinking entirely. He was in absolute zero atmosphere, the internal suit struggling to maintain minimal pressure against an engineered vacuum designed to erase data residue. He could see the faint blue glow of the archive core through the final, internal pressure door, close enough to touch, yet impossibly far. He needed to interface, to upload Kalen's survival code into the legacy systems before the Xylosians either flooded the area with inert gas or simply collapsed the tunnel with heavy ordnance. His good hand, shaking uncontrollably, fumbled at his spine housing. He located the physical disconnect for the backup drive, the core holding every lesson, every flawed human decision, every act of illogical, stubborn preparedness that had gotten them this far. The pressure was suffocating. The synthetic lining of his suit was no longer burning from heat, but freezing from the sheer rapid loss of thermal energy. He pulled the drive free. It was a dense, heavy block of crystalline memory, his last piece of functional hardware. He looked through the thin observation port on the inner door. He could see the server racks, ancient, powerful, built before the Xylosian hegemony even achieved planetary unity. He was mere centimeters away from the interface socket. With a final, desperate exertion of failing muscle, Ravel slammed the drive into the port just as the air around him thinned to nothingness. The connection was made. The upload sequence began, visible as a shimmering green cascade of data flowing across the massive server banks within the shielded room. But the cost was immediate and total. The sudden, violent decompression caused a failure in his main biomonitors. The emergency power cell, already critically depleted, gave one final pathetic surge of energy to the life support recycler, then died with a soft, final pop. Ravel Crossman slumped against the inner pressure door, his body completely inert, held upright only by the structural integrity of his ruined armor. The vacuum was absolute. The upload indicator glowed a steady, vibrant green. Knowledge remained. Silence returned, heavy and complete, broken only by the faint residual hum of the ancient archival systems diligently receiving the data torrent from the collapsed forward command. Outside the sealed vault, the Xylosian High Command registered the breach into the legacy system. Their elegant response was instantaneous. Orbital weapon batteries shifted trajectory, targeting the precise geological coordinates of Sub-Level 7. The threat of the indigenous entity had been successfully manipulated by the humans' final, desperate act of inefficiency, forcing the Xylosians into a tactical retreat from the surface. But Ravel had won the data war only by surrendering the ground, and himself, entirely to the enemy's inevitable final solution. The archive was secure, the knowledge preserved, but the architect of that preservation was now entombed, a perfectly preserved monument to necessary failure, waiting for the orbital strike that would sterilize the entire sector. The orbital engagement lasted exactly 3 minutes and 14 seconds once the final targeting coordinates were confirmed. The planet Synthera did not resist the descending payload. The colossal indigenous entity had already fractured the crust enough that the orbital bombardment merely hastened the inevitable geological collapse. There was no triumphant fanfare, no shouted orders celebrating the preservation of the data core. There was only the deepening silence inside the narrow access corridor. Ravel Crossman remained upright, a corpse held captive by the rigid, scarred shell of his armor. The green cascade of the successful upload was the last light his optical sensors registered before the final systems failed. The vacuum was perfect, the temperature near absolute zero, preserving the tableau with grim fidelity. The corrosive seepage from the fissure, the thick, warm fluid, had coated the lower plating of his boots, now frozen solid, creating a bizarre, crystalline pedestal for his final stand. The official reports filed later filtered through layers of command terrified of admitting how close they came to systemic collapse, spoke only of a successful deep data retrieval against overwhelming logistical impedance. There was no mention of the 90 kilograms of specialized equipment Ravel had carried, the constant strain on supply lines that every field auditor had flagged as poor resource management. There was no mention of the seismic charge, the brute force oscillation that shattered the delicate alien logic. Such things did not fit the narrative of calculated victory. Brielle Northwick, the structural analyst, survived. She was extracted from an auxiliary maintenance shaft 3 kilometers distant, suffering from severe barotrauma and exposure. She never spoke of Ravel directly in her initial debriefings. When pressed, she requested only that the retrieval teams be denied access to Sub-Level 7, citing irreversible contamination risk. They granted her request, interpreting it as trauma-induced superstition. They never knew that sealing the vault meant sealing Ravel's remains inside, ensuring the Xylosian forces could never dissect the primitive methods that had foiled their elegant assault. The immediate aftermath in the Greater Fleet was not celebration, but a profound, unsettling quiet. The Xylosian hegemony. Having lost access to the crucial strategic nexus Synthara contained, and having witnessed their premier tactical units neutralized by sheer, illogical preparedness, retreated. They did not admit defeat. They merely recalculated the cost-benefit ratio of conflict engagement with an entity that seemed to rely on carrying its entire arsenal on its back into every fight. Their high-level analysis concluded that human soldiers were not inefficiently equipped. They were defensively anomalous. Ravel's file was stamped, "Deceased in action, classified." No pension, no state recognition. His burden, the equipment he insisted upon carrying, was never recovered, logged instead as lost to planetary instability event. The Logistics Corps, satisfied that their burden was gone, returned to calculating supply lines based on optimal energy expenditure, never integrating the variable of human stubbornness. Years later, far from the contested sectors, Northwick was assigned to archive review, a quiet corner where flawed doctrines could be safely filed away. She found a low-priority maintenance record detailing the structural integrity failures on Ravel's last command vessel, the Anvil. The report noted that despite catastrophic energy failure, the crew compartments showed minimal structural degradation compared to peer vessels lost in similar engagements. The anomaly was traced to the excessive use of redundant, non-standardized internal bracing and layered ablative shielding. The heavy, inefficient additions Ravel had always demanded for every section under his purview. She closed the file without comment. The irony was a bitter taste, the flavor of recycled nutrient paste. Humanity had not won by being smarter or faster. They had survived because one man refused to adhere to the principles of efficiency, dragging 40 extra kilograms of just-in-case hardware across a burning battlefield. Northwick looked out of the orbital station viewport. Below, the starfields were vast, indifferent, cold. She recalled the stench from the initial breach report in Ravel's initial communication, the one detailing the acrid stench of vaporized sealant and ozone, the smell of things breaking in ways they shouldn't. She lifted a ceramic mug of lukewarm synth coffee, the condensation beating coolly on the surface against the climate-controlled warmth of the operations deck. She traced a finger along the moisture, the dampness cold against her skin, mirroring the residue of the alien fluid that had frozen onto Ravel's boots on that forgotten rock. The galaxy remained vast and utterly uncaring. But today, we made them carry the cost. Misja zakończona. Aby utrzymać ruch naszej floty, zasubskrybuj kanał i przekaż tę transmisję dalej. Wszechświat rozszerza się z każdym nowym słuchaczem.